let's start looking at the actual syntax of CSS. What do I mean by that? It's how we're actually going to code our CSS. Really, one of the important things is I've looked at my HTML file. From the previous example, I've left as much of that basic HTML code as possible. Again, I'm looking at a bunch of headers, I'm looking at a bunch of paragraph and a bunch of bold tags. And maybe just for fun, why don't we add an underline tag that says underline. I close it. Maybe I'll change this from 2 to 3 so that we remember what we're looking at. And again, let's go back to our HTML page. Let's load it in here. Reload it. There's my underline tag that seems to have come in with actually an underline. So we might have to change that in our reset. But let's actually start playing with CSS. So there was nothing in my main.css. It's actually really empty. And the first thing we're going to look at is how CSS is actually written. Remember, there's 3 types of CSS. There's global tags, there's classes, and there's IDs. And each of these is called up individually. The first one is we're going to look at a global tag. And notice that the CSS file is really empty. There's nothing in there. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to actually try to interact with a lot of these global tags. So the first thing I'm going to do is, let's say if I want to influence the body tag, which is this tag right here. I don't want to put brackets. I want to actually just make a reference to body. CSS is broken down into 2 main steps. And this is where you have to be really careful about it. The first one is the reference to the tag. And the second one is the brackets inside of it. Really critical, the majority of mistakes that you will make in CSS. Everyone thinks that they have to be about compatibility. Everyone thinks that they have to be about something that doesn't work in the browser. Majority of these mistakes that I've seen with other professionals and with students is someone forgets a tag. As silly, as ridiculous as that sounds, the majority of your problems will handle there. And really what we want to do is, if I was going to write a series of CSS and I wanted to make reference to the bold tag, I would set up the tags first. I would set up, let's say we want to make reference to the header 1. I actually want to write as much of these out as possible, especially as I'm testing. And you notice what I do is I go through, I write the tags that I want to work on, and then I actually put in the open and the close bracket. Because again, there's a lot of heartache here. I want to try to get good organization, keep good housekeeping, and that's housekeeping tip number 1. So that's really important. When I open up a tag, you notice in Sublime I just hit enter and it automatically indented it. That's one of the things that I can do is, once I'm inside the CSS tag, I want to indent the code that I'm in there. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's change the background. There's a sample code called background. And you notice the great thing is in Sublime, once I added it in there, it had that wonderful type ahead. And I could just keep on typing. Again, background, I'm going to say the background color, and I can type in red. We'll talk more about background and how it works in colors. The second good housekeeping tip is, I'm going to save this really, really quickly, and I'm going to go back, and I'm going to reload it, and now I have a red background. Let's go back to Sublime, and let's talk about tip number 2. When I add another attribute in CSS, I actually want to add it as a second line. Most typical programmers will know that adding in a new line, we're going to have to add some sort of character. In this case, it's a semicolon. I hit enter, and I'm back down to the next line. This is actually the next place where the majority of problems will come into. Not just a missing bracket, but it actually might be a missing line. And that semicolon, we have to wait. We have to actually make sure that the semicolon's in there. So let's add some margin. I'm going to add some margin to the top. Again, it's going to be 60 pixels. And just for good housekeeping, I want to put that semicolon in here. If we're looking at the syntax itself, the syntax of the characteristics are based on the attribute and the name of the attribute, in this case background color, background dash color, background dash shape. It might be margin dash top, margin dash bottom. The dash is there to separate the hierarchy. Are you influencing the margin? Are you influencing the top? Is it a border? Is it the border top? So we always want to keep that in play. Again, if you ever have any questions, always go back to my reference documents. I love keeping these in front of me. I can come back to the web, and if you type in CSS reference, there's piles of websites that give you reference documents. One of the things I love about having a good development environment is a good program, and this again, the power of color coding, will tell you whether or not I've actually crashed the car or whether or not I'm driving in the right lane. If I don't, you notice here it didn't catch the semicolon because I'm at the end of the line. But if I happen to delete the semicolon, you notice that this becomes white. So I always want to be careful. I always want to make sure that I'm actually doing the right thing. So if, let's say I decided to put a semicolon here, now that becomes white. If I decided to put an underscore here, now that stops working well. And again, I'm always looking at it. I want to make sure that the majority of the problems that I have are syntax. That's why I love great applications that do color coding. I want to catch these tiny little small mistakes. I can't tell you the number of times that I've actually started coding pages, and I'll spend 2 to 3 hours on a page and realize that the problem would be a semicolon. Or the bigger problem is that the problem is a bracket. You notice that in this application, every time I mess something up, it shows it to me in white. In Dreamweaver, it'll actually go from green to red. You can actually set color coding to actually do a validation for you. So this is really the power of it, again, is trying to catch the syntax. I'm going to move down and let's talk about adding an ID. An ID in the code itself. We're not even talking about how to add it into HTML just yet. We're really talking about how to add the syntax into your CSS file. To reference an ID, I actually reference it with a hashtag. Some people might refer to it as hashtag if you love Twitter. I've used it as the £. There are multiple ways of calling it. Let's just say it's a hashtag. And I'm going to call them the ID. Again, IDs, as I said before, are individually named. I don't want to use them again. The number one problem with an ID is that you've actually used it again. And when the browser reads it, it doesn't know which one to take as a priority. Just like the browser in HTML, CSS is written from top to bottom. So if I was thinking about the structure of a page, how would I structure it? I'd actually start with my global tags on top, my IDs, and then my classes. Again, the prioritization, it's all about a hierarchy on these. An ID will overwrite a class might overwrite something else. So I really want to keep them in place because I might catch some problems there. Good organization tells us the cleaner I can lay out my CSS file, the easier it will be to find problems, the easier it will be to sort of tune things and change things. We'll talk more about that organization when we talk about laying out your style guide, but let's go back to IDs. So let's say I'm going to call an ID called Adrian. You notice it becomes green. I add in the close and open bracket. Let's call an ID Meg. And let's call an ID called Robert. There are now 3 separate IDs. In this case, I can use them for multiple things. I might use them for, I don't know, let's say margins, 50 pixels. I'm going to use the Meg one as a new line. I'm going to maybe use padding left, 20 pixels, and Robert will be, I don't know, let's use margin bottom, 10 pixels. I know they work. In this case, I'm looking at the CSS attributes. They're looking good. Things like measurements are in red, the numbers are working again, and of course I have these attributes in blue and these IDs. I'm going to save them. I'm going to go back to my HTML file. I'm going to reload. Well, and of course nothing happens. And the reason nothing happens is because I haven't made reference to the HTML yet. I actually haven't connected them back to the HTML. Remember, a CSS is just an individual file. If you haven't tagged it within the code in HTML, you're actually not going to see it work together. So unlike global tags, as soon as I reference an H1, so in this case, I'm just going to say margin top is 60 on H1. I'm going to say margin top is 50. And you notice I caught a quick little problem right here when I copied it. It actually brought along the semicolon. I'm going to delete that. And it still shows up as a little funny. Let's troubleshoot. First thing I'm going to look is what went wrong. I look at this automatically, something's broken. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to check my syntax. I'm going to check that I have open and close brackets. Yes, that looks clean. Yes, that looks beautiful. Perfect. What's the next thing I'm going to check? I'm going to check that the semicolons and the colons are in the right place. So looking up at the example, remember, it's an attribute followed by a colon, followed by the metric of what that attribute is, in this case red, 50 pixels, and a semicolon to start the new line. Let's look at the next line. I've got the attribute in margin top. I caught it. There's a semicolon there. Change it back to a colon, get rid of the semicolon, and guess what? It's now working. Again, it's all about just going through these basic housekeeping rules. Did I catch it? Did it break? Did I fix it? Again, here's my example. I change it to a semicolon, and it's now working again. And what I want to do is, before I actually drive myself crazy and check it in the HTML, I want to do a pass here. And this is why you notice that I break things out as individual lines. I'll actually check it. Again, the color coding is really helpful. If I'm working on an application that doesn't have color coding, might be a little harder to check, but I want to do my rules of thumb. That the brackets are always there, that there's a semicolon from one line to another, and that there's a colon between the attribute name and the attribute value. So now I'm actually going to go back to my browser, I reload, and here is that 60 pixel margin on the header. If I wanted to change it and say, well, why don't we add another attribute to this? I'm going to add a new line. I will indent, and I will say font size is 20 pixel. I might actually add the new line here, keep it indented as well. I might indent this line as well. In this case, I notice that there's a problem. And the problem is, again, let's go back to our rules of thumb. Do we have brackets at the end? Yes. Do we have a colon in between the attribute name and the attribute? Yes. Third problem, there's no semicolon. I hit OK, I save it, and now let's go back to our friendly neighborhood Chrome, reload it, and here you go. I've changed the header 1 text. Again, the real power that we're looking at is that whatever I change here, it's going to change in the HTML. In this case, as I was making reference before, global tags will work regardless if you tag them or not. As soon as it finds the value, it'll display it here. In this case, if I don't have an H3 or the H3 is empty, the header 3, there will be no values applied to it. On an ID, if we want to make reference to an ID, let's say I want to make a reference to an ID in this paragraph, I will actually say ID equals, type in the name Adrian. You notice I don't need the hashtag, only the value name. I can go to this paragraph right here or this header and say ID equals Meg. I saved it. Now, anytime I add these values, they'll make reference to the HTML. I'll save my files. I'm going to come back here, and here you go. That padding that I've added in the IDs now gets applied to the HTML. It really is about happening in real time. This is why I always recommend going back and forth from the browser to the code to make sure that it works. If I do something in Adrian, I want to check it. If I do something in the Meg ID, I want to check it. Similarly, the next step after this of the search syntax is looking at the class name. To make reference to a class, I'm going to use a period. And let's call it bold text, open close bracket, and I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to say the font size is 30 pixels, again, semicolon. The color is white, semicolon, just to be safe, good housekeeping. And then I like to copy the class name. And again, I can add a pile of classes I want. a lot of times when I work, I might actually lay out all the classes, all the IDs, add as many attributes as I want, and then go back to the index file and begin to drop them in. In this case, I'm going to add a class to the paragraph text. So now I'm going to write class equals quotation marks, they pop in, bold text, go back to my browser, reload it, and there you go. Here's my class, it works. We'll talk more about each of them and where and how to use them as we go further, but this has really been about looking at the syntax, trying to catch as many of the problems as we want. And again, just to review, we want to be able to look that when we call different things in CSS, that they're very clean, that they're really structured. Again, good housekeeping rules of 3, check syntax. Are there quotation marks? Are there brackets that are open and closed? The second one, make sure that there's colons in between the attribute name and the attribute value. The third one is let's make sure between one line and the other that there's a semicolon. After that, we want to make sure that there is nothing in between the global tag. If we're making a reference to body, it's just the word body. If we're making a reference to H1, it's just the word H1, followed by a space in the brackets. If we want to make reference to an ID, we're going to make sure that there is the #/hashtag in front of it, and that when we make reference to a class, that there's a period. As long as we keep all these rules of thumb and housekeeping involved, we're going to be making great coding. Again, we looked at CSS markup and the syntax of how it works. In the next chapter, we're going to be looking at creating a style sheet and how we're actually going to be able to take a look at the CSS we've written here and the HTML to begin to set that style sheet up.